Hey students, this is your Professor O, and this is Biomedical Ethics Day 22, and we're going to be scrutinizing the assertions embryos are not persons. Before I get into that and the arguments that scrutinize that idea, I just wanted to draw your attention to a video. You can watch this when I post the lecture notes. It's about an argument that didn't come up in the last lecture, and that is whether or not embryonic stem cell research could be permitted in the first 14 days. And what's unique about or special about the first 14 days is that the embryo is totipotent, meaning that it is capable of monozygotic twinning. All right, so that is the process which identical twins come from. And the thought is that, hey, if this thing can split into two, then there's no reason to believe that there is a single individual there, right? Because once you have two, well, you know, which one is the person identical with? Well, it can't be either. It can't be both, right? That's impossible. And so the thought is that, hey, at this stage, it's just too primitive to be any kind of individual. And if it's not an individual, it's not a person, all right? But after 14 days, there's like this differentiation occurs, this thing called a primitive streak, and that is when it's no longer capable of twinning. All right, so you might think that you could just use embryos that are not 14 days old for your embryonic stem cell research. All right, check that out. Okay, check that out. All right, so we talked about Sandel's arguments. All right, the main premise that he was interested in defending was really this one, and he spent the most time defending this aspect of his argument. Okay, an embryo does not have the moral status of a person. Okay, he was really interested in just getting these two things off the ground. Right, you could do research on embryos via cloning. Okay, you could clone them and then extract their stem cells, or you could extract stem cells from leftover embryos in IVF treatment. Okay, so that's what he was interested in defending. He doesn't think the argument depends, at least for the belief, that embryos are persons is dependent on a religious belief. He thinks that the Kantian humanity argument could do the trick, but he thinks that the argument is flawed. Right? Humanity is ambiguous. Okay, there's a species sense and a personal sense. And the embryo may have the former, but it certainly doesn't have the latter. Right? And he has the acorn oak tree analogy that he uses to kind of get the argument going, right? To get your intuitions going. It's true that there's a kind of continuity of development between an acorn and an oak tree, but he thinks these two are just totally different. One is very small and insignificant. It does not have anything like the properties of an actual oak tree that is large, beautiful, and something you would want on your college campus, right? It has a kind of grandeur, and obviously, it's like a weighty thing, whereas the acorn is just kind of insignificant and small. All right, and so some sort of change happens along the way that where we could say, you know what, we should probably accord some sort of respect to an oak tree. I mean, not total respect, but that's not something that we should transfer to the acorn. Okay. So at some point, the nascent human being achieves moral status or personhood. Okay. It's not something that's endowed. Right. Personhood is not something that's endowed with the embryo. Okay, so some kind of change happens, some acquisition of some relevant property makes one a person along the way. All right. He also just thinks that the belief in the equal personhood view just isn't going to line up with our intuitions about certain things. Okay, so the big one really, I think, is this one. Is the 5 embryos versus the 5-year-old girl rescue case. So if to choose one or the other, it's just obvious that you should choose the 5-year-old girl. All right. Anybody who would choose the 5 embryos just doesn't seem to have a grasp on reality and the kind of pain and terror and loss that this poor girl would feel, whereas these would just have no understanding what's happening to them whatsoever. Okay. Another one too that is interesting is the natural embryo loss argument, right? Somewhere between 50 and 70%, says Sandel, are lost. And this just isn't really taken seriously, right? I mean, if our infant mortality rate was like that, we would totally respond and do something, okay? But with embryos, we don't. And so it just seems to be that this view just can't, it just doesn't line up with our behavior, all right? So that is important for him as well. He thinks that's telling. And then there's no binary options for respect. So it's not like embryos don't have any kind of value whatsoever. He doesn't just think they're tools, right? He thinks that they should be accorded a measure of respect. And we talked about the giant sequoias, right? If you do environmental ethics, you might care about this, all right? Like think of a national park itself, right? That deserves some respect, all right? It's not just a mere tool. Okay, but it could be used to serve the interests of persons. But I did pose this question that we were thinking hard about in the discussion sections about how does one pay respect to an embryo that one is allowed to manufacture and destroy for research purposes, all right? Okay, and by the way, I just want to say that the way that you all are responding to my discussion questions is hugely impressive. You are really putting a lot of thought into your answers, and this is great. Okay, keep that up because, for me and the way this thing is playing out with COVID-19, that could really play a role in minimizing the requirements for your final assignment. All right, so just keep that up. That's a little tantalizer over there for you. I really, really like watching you all think. You're thinking hard, and I appreciate that. Okay. All right. So let's get into Robert George. Okay. This guy is a teacher at Princeton University. He is professor of jurisprudence. I think he has like a law degree with some training in philosophy from Oxford University. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, and he is very much kind of the big thinker of conservative Christianity, all right? So you can follow this little piece by the New York Times that profiles him. He has published a ton of books and lots of articles on everything from like abortion, stem cell research, obviously, and marriage equality. He comments on all these things, and he certainly is an unashamed and unabashed Roman Catholic. However, he does not ever bring in any religious premises into his arguments. And that's because he is a purveyor of a natural law position. Now, natural law and ethics is complicated and it's difficult to understand. And his view in particular is not easy to understand. Okay. I mean, I've gone to some graduate level seminars and I studied with some people in graduate school who take this view, and you got to do quite a bit of work to really understand the intricacies of it. This article on the Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to start, right? And you might be wondering, well, wait a second now, right? How is this a non-religious view, especially if the natural law relates to divine providence, right? This is an argument that Thomas Aquinas talks about in his Summas and in his thought. And so you might think, well, it's got to be religious. And the answer is kind of yes or no. Yes, it does fit into an order of divine providence. But the part that George and natural law ethicists really take up is how it relates to our practical rationality, right? Practical rationality is a rationality that is concerned with our means to end reasoning, all right? And emphasis on the end, okay? So the end of our reasoning, all right, in a natural law ethics is a state of human flourishing, all right? A state of human flourishing, and human flourishing consists of a number of different basic goods, right? And we also have knowledge of these. We can kind of just think about them, right? And so things that come to mind that are, what are the things that we can just act for the sake of, for no other reason, All right, so we're not trying to find something else. We're not trying to get something else. We're not using them as a means to an end. They are our end. And so things like life, um, uh, marriage, uh, health, knowledge, these are things that are just, they're worth acting for. Okay, and so you can build a whole kind of theory of the good, and name and enumerate these basic goods. You know, aesthetic experience is another one. Okay, and so we have knowledge of these, and so we act for the sake of these, right? And so if you get into the practical rationality piece here, let's link down to that. Okay, boy, now I'm getting lost. This is what happens when you start studying natural laws. You get lost in the weeds of all the different information that you need to understand to really get it. Okay, but here's kind of like one of the basic ideas. Is the precepts of natural law are binding by nature. No beings could share our human nature that fail to be bound by the precepts of natural law. Right, so they're absolutist. Okay, you have to kind of understand, right, that like I'm looking at a textbook here. I'm trying to find, here's a basic principle kind of action, right? An action is right if and only if and because in performing that action, one does not directly violate any of the basic goods that are constituent of our flourishing, right? So human life, procreation, knowledge, sociability, these kinds of things, right? And it makes a big use of the doctrine of double effect. We've talked a lot about that. So we don't intend to damage things, but we might accept damage that is only foreseen. All right. So I do commend you to this if you're interested in this. This is a kind of a long and technical piece. But if you're interested in this and how it is that like Roman Catholic thinkers think, without appealing to religious premises, this is what you gotta study. And I should say this is not just the province of Roman Catholics either, right? You can find kind of the basic outline of a natural law in some of the Greek thinkers like the Stoics, right? Some people think that Plato was an originator. Aristotle certainly had something to say about this, all right? So you can, it's a long, ancient, and respectable position, although it's not super easy to understand like utilitarianism. So that's one of the things that has going against it. All right, so I know that was kind of a detour, right? Another thing you got to know about George is that he was on the President's Council of Bioethics for President Bush from 2002 to 2009. So he was there, I think, for its entire existence. All right, so he had a lot to say about stem cell research. In fact, he and Sandel, I think, personally argued together. So that's why I'm having you read them. If you want to find, I think, probably the most definitive defense of the idea that the embryo is entitled to moral status, that could be for popular consumption, although this is not an easy book to read at all. It's this book here, Embryo Defense of Human Life. There are other more philosophically robust books by authors I could suggest to you, but they're pretty hard. This one is a little more accessible. And George likes to do a lot of co-authoring. He co-authors with some philosophers. One of them, his name is Christopher Tollefson. And full disclosure, Chris Tollefson was my dissertation supervisor. He is the chair of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. And you should really get to know Chris and his writings. You should look him up. He's an exceptionally clear writer. And you will probably disagree with his views. I disagree with some of his views, but I also agree with quite a few of them. And he is somebody who just welcomes disagreement and is very good at the give and take of argument. And I really appreciated learning from him. So if you just want a model of a good philosopher and how to do philosophy, even if you don't really agree with him, he's a good guy. All right. So I have to disclose that. I think that's important for just teaching this class fairly. Another book too that he writes about, this is about his views of the human person. This is also important to understand. He is a big critic of body self dualism, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about that as lecture goes on, but he also likes to co-author a lot with Patrick Lee, all right, who's another philosopher who takes up some of these issues. All right. So I commend those two books to you. They are interesting if you're interested in this kind of stuff. One of the things you have to know about George, is that he holds to an animalist view of the person, right? So the reason why he's critiquing body self-dualism is that he thinks it makes an illegitimate distinction between the organism, right, and our personhood, right? Animalism is one that identifies our personal identity with our animal existence, all right? So we are fundamentally animals or organisms, all right? So we live animal lives, we live the life of an organism, and so if we are persons, right, and if persons is, if that's a substantial feature of us, then that's just in our nature as an animal, all right? A rational animal, as it were, okay, that Aristotle likes to talk about. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's important to understand. What we are is identical with an animal, and that is something that he defends. Okay, all right, so let's get into his central argument here. All right, this is, let me just do this here. I don't understand why Google Documents isn't consistent. It really bothers me. All right, anyway, okay. Premise 1, human embryos are human beings and are entitled to the same protections against killing that human beings are entitled to at later stages of development. Okay, that's what he's going to be defending throughout the paper that you read. Okay, premise 2 is not a premise that he defends explicitly, right? He assumes this, right? If this is so, then embryo destructive research is immoral, right? So therefore it's immoral. Okay, so premise 1, like I said, is the main focus of his paper. And he does assume, too, because along with Sandel, all right, he assumes that consequentialism is false for the purposes of this paper. All right, so if you're a consequentialist, you might just, look, okay, let's accept that one. I don't know why you would, but you could accept this, but then reject this, all right? Because you might just think, you know what? Hey, what we should do, right, if we can kind of maximize the good here, is that you should kill one to benefit others, right? And so this is like the classic organ redistribution case that is sometimes used to critique consequentialism. And just to describe the case to you, right, this woman, collapses on a hospital floor unconscious. And it's known to this doctor, right, that she's got 4 organs here that these 4 patients needs. And she has the right kind of tissue typing and genetic properties that would be good matches. And so, this person's a surgeon. Is like, well, isn't this an opportunity to really maximize the benefits here of survivability? Okay. And so the idea is then, well, should you then redistribute the organs, to this person, which would effectively kill this person here, right? So, look, Sandel and George, throughout this whole discussion, are assuming this much, right? Even if killing that patient and transplanting her organs to save the 4 would really produce the best outcomes for everyone involved, it would still be wrong. Okay, it would still be wrong. So I know that some of you take a more consequentialist persuasion, and so you might be wondering, well, I don't know, this is quite an assumption here, all right? And that's all right. You can attack that from that perspective, but just know that this is what's lingering in the background, okay, is that, well, I don't know if you should be doing this, right? This seems to be like a deep violation of this poor person's rights here. Like you haven't gotten their consent, right? Life might be inviolable, all right? And so those are the issues, right, that are kind of, underlying support for premise 2, but they're being assumed, right? So I'm just kind of alerting you to that. Okay. So anyway, one of the big questions that George is raising, kind of right at the beginning, is like, look, if it's wrong to do this sort of thing when somebody's permanently unconscious, or a newborn baby, or even a late-term fetus, why not an embryo too? Okay, why not an embryo too? All right, so let's get into his claims here. And let's just kind of start talking about each one, all right? All right, so here's the animalist thesis I was talking about, right? The adult human being reading this text is identical with the embryo he or she once was. Okay, so you got to take continuity here seriously. All right, you are identical with a human organism, and that organism once was a human embryo. Okay, so what you are now, it didn't come into existence at a later date than the date that the embryo came into existence. All right, you came to exist when the embryo came to exist. All right, you also will not go out of existence before your body dies. Okay, so if you think that, hey, you get some kind of like head injury and you are in a coma, right, but your body can still be supported on life support, you're still around. Okay, you haven't died. All right. All right. And that'll be important. Okay, that'll be important, especially when we get into our unit on brain death. All right. So this is something you might think is more controversial than you think. All right. But one of the things that he wants to say here is that the property of being an embryo is just a phase of your existence. Okay? It's kind of like being a child, being a baby, being a fetus, right? That's just a phase of your existence. Okay? So what you are is then, fundamentally speaking, is an organism. You're not a soul or a brain or a center of consciousness, right? And what I mean by soul here is like the Cartesian soul, that it gets infused into a body somehow, and somehow it operates on the body as some kind of machine, right? That is not what he's talking about. George does affirm the reality of a soul, but it's a different kind of soul. It's Aristotle's type of soul, a principle of organization, right, that gives a body its form. And that is a different idea altogether. Okay? But he doesn't think that you're identical with a form. He thinks that you are like a body-soul composite, which is just an organism. Okay? Okay. All right. So the relevant question then is whether someone who is in the phase of being an embryo should be killed to benefit others. And he thinks no. Right? And this actually is important. This is important, right? Should somebody be killed, right, if they're in this phase? All right. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is a very different question than, who would you rather save? All right. Who would you rather save? Right. Here's the thing: is that duties to rescue are different from duties not to kill. Okay, this is something that George definitely thinks. Okay, and he does actually take on elsewhere the embryo rescue case. All right, he thinks that duties to rescue can be informed by other factors such as attachments and our empathy with the experience of suffering. Okay, whereas duties not to kill are actually aren't informed by these things. Okay, so he does think that you should rescue the 5-year-old girl. Okay, he does think that, but he does believe that at some point the number of embryos is going to tip the scales. Okay, so he doesn't know exactly when that is. All right, you can actually read his response here to this particular problem on this website. They get into the details, right? He doesn't know how many embryos it would be, all right, but he does think that, I don't know, like, what if you have like 100,000 that you can save? And also, let's also stipulate this, that those 100,000, there's a good portion of those who have a very good chance of being implanted and carried to term, right, and becoming babies, right? Then, right, you might think, hey, this really kind of changes like the obviousness of this. Now, if you're just talking about IVF, leftover embryos or embryos that have been cloned and they're just going to be used for research, and then you have a 5-year-old girl, well, it's obvious here that the circumstances would have you go for the 5-year-old girl, right? But, if you had like 100,000 embryos, there was a good chance that a lot of those would be implanted. Well, maybe you should reconsider your choice, okay? The other thing you have to understand is that there can be a moral difference between destroying a life and failing to secure the conditions for a life's survival. All right, so there can be, a difference in doing harm and allowing harm. And for consequentialists, again, this is very hard to swallow. It's like, well, don't you just end up with somebody harmed in the end? And, isn't that just what matters? And George says no, right? The actions and how you get there and how you make how you proceed through your deliberations and what you choose to do actually matters quite a bit. Your intentions towards the basic human goods and whether or not your will is upright towards those goods matters quite a bit more, right, than just the consequences. Okay? He also thinks that protections against killing are based on a respect for the kind of thing we are and not some quality that would come in degrees, right, that we happen to possess, right? So this is the equality thesis, right? We saw the animalist thesis earlier. This is the equality thesis, right? So he thinks that those who think that we gain some personhood making attribute, have to point to some morally important capacity that we gain, right, before and after birth. So like things like consciousness or rationality are two examples. All right, these can come in degrees, and so you might think, well, to people who have a higher level of consciousness, like a human adult versus like that of a squirrel, is that what makes a moral difference? Or does Einstein, who's smarter than everybody else, does he have more moral status? And he, George is actually no. Like, this is not how you should be parceling out protections against killing, right? Degreed properties are just not the sorts of things that are going to do the trick for you. I mean, what if you just fall short of being conscious, or just fall short of being rational? Like, you're on the cusp of being there, we can kill you and use you for research purposes, but then like a minute later, now you have this big break, like now you fall under protections. Okay, that seems arbitrary. He also thinks too that these kinds of capacities, right, are ignoring something that's really important, right? And that is a distinction between capacities that are immediately exercisable, right? So obviously, like a toddler is going to have an immediately exercisable capacity for consciousness. You can wake one up, okay? That's something we all have too, right? We can exercise our rationality, right? Embryos don't have these things, but they do possess them in root form. Okay, if they didn't possess them in root form, then they would never develop into anything that had these immediately exercisable properties or capacities, right? So the immediately exercisable ones are like a first order capacity, and the root forms are like a second order ones. You have the capacity to have the capacity. And that's just part of your nature as a rational animal, all right? Since it's in the nature then, right, of the embryo to develop these more significant capacities, right, this nature then merits our respect. All right, so you think of the difference between like a fetus and a placenta, all right? So those two things are in the womb together, and one of them is of human origin, but is not a human organism. Okay, that's the placenta. It does not have the capacity to develop into something that is rational. It is not a rational animal. Rather, it's just an organ. Okay, whereas the fetus is a rational animal. It has that nature. It is in the process of developing, right, what its nature is directed to. That is the capacities for consciousness and rationality. Okay, so that nature itself is something, right, that everybody shares in, and it gives us this nice kind of foundation for an egalitarian commitment. Why should we treat people equally? We got people with we want to respect the rights of people of Down syndrome as much as the rights of people who don't have Down syndrome and are, on the athletic field or in the academy, who have all these high functioning capacities. We want to say, no, your lives are equally important. It would be a crime to kill either one of you. Okay. And what's the basis for that? Well, it's the fact that you both share in human nature, and human nature has a rational nature, right? You're a rational animal. Okay. Now you might think, well, wait a second. Now, why does species membership matter? Well, what matters is that you're in the species of rational animal, right? It's not just like human Homo sapiens. That doesn't really matter so much. Like if there was an alien, like a Martian or a Klingon or something like that, they would be rational animals too, and they would be subjects of rights and respect and all those kinds of things. All right. He also thinks there's just no good arguments to deny premise one. And so most of his paper is taking on these arguments, right? So he's got the skin cell argument. So you can end up getting an embryo by taking, I think, the nuclei from a skin cell and transferring it into the shell of a human egg. And, I'm oversimplifying this, but then you can end up kind of with a cloned embryo that way, okay? And so, hey, look, here's the thing. If the embryo has the potential to develop into this human being, and the skin cell does too, well, then doesn't the skin cell merit our respect also? And that's just absurd, okay? That's how the skin cell argument goes, all right? But George says that assumes a false analogy between the relevant forms of potentiality, okay? The skin cell has like a passive potentiality to become a person, right? It can be acted upon in such a way through the mechanics of our technology to create a person, right? But it is not internally directed or actively developing that way, the way an embryo is, all right? The embryo is an organism while the skin cell is not, right? And so he thinks that there's a morally relevant difference there, all right? The brain death argument, okay? This is one reason why I chose this paper, because this gets into and relates to our topic for next week about brain death and whether it is or really death. But this also, the way the argument goes is that, look, a brain dead person has no rights. Okay, we can take its organs and redistribute them to people. All right, we want, of course, there to be a consent process. All right, but that is, that's one of the reasons why we take organs from brain dead bodies, but not bodies that aren't brain dead. Okay, and so the idea is like, well, look, if the absence of a brain here is what changes the moral status of a body, all right, we might think that a brainless embryo, right, has a similar moral status. Okay, again, George thinks this is a false analogy, right, because the brain dead body, right, is no longer a human organism. All right, so the rationale for brain death is that the death of the brain entails the death of the organism. It's not just like a loss of personhood, okay? That is not what he thinks is going on. Like, because you might think that personhood is bound up with consciousness, right? And so if you lose your consciousness, you can still persist onward, but we don't take organs from PBS patients, all right? That's not something we do. And also, right, the brain dead body is no longer internally directed towards developing or being a rational animal, right? It loses its nature, right, as a rational animal. Okay? The brainless embryo, by contrast, is directed towards developing a brain. It has that capacity, right, to develop a brain. And so, right, it is just, these are two different kinds of things, again. All right, there are two different kinds of things. The acorn oak argument, right, assumes a false analogy between the relevant reasons for respect. Okay, so for the oak, it is its accidental properties of beauty and grandeur, right? So if it were sick, we'd chop it down. Okay, and really, the oak should be properly, if we're going to do a strict analogy here, that is analogous to an adult human being, and the oak sapling is analogous to a human baby. All right, so, but obviously human babies have moral status, at least for George and Sandel here. Right, there's some people who actually don't think that. We can get into that later in the discussion. But he thinks the analogy is just going to break down, right? The oak is valued because it has these accidental properties. Oh, it just happens to be beautiful, right? It happens to like have an aesthetic that we like, and so that's why we care about it. All right. For the human, though, it's nature that we respect. Okay, so we respect the human nature of newborns. All right, we don't respect the oaky nature of oak saplings. Okay, and so that's just, again, we have a category difference here, right? We have a category difference here. We're comparing apples and oranges, and so this analogy just does not work, right? All right, the argument for monozygotic twinning does not show that the early embryo is not a unified individual before twinning any more than the division of a flatworm shows that it was not a unified individual before twinning. Okay? All right, so this is an old argument that Aristotle brought up. It's like, hey, you can cut a worm in half and now you got two, right? That doesn't mean that the one that was crawling around beforehand wasn't a worm, right? So same thing with the embryonic argument, okay? You still have an individual, but then a division occurs and now you have two. There's a question about, well, what's the status of the embryo beforehand? Does it survive on? Does it go out of existence? And that's just a big metaphysical question that we might not know the answer to, but not knowing the answer to that doesn't prove that there wasn't an individual there beforehand. All right, last thing he has to say, right, is that the natural embryo loss argument is weak. He actually doesn't really address it in this paper, okay, but I've heard him talk about this in other venues. And this is really his response to it. He says, look, nobody's moral status depends on how others happen to respond to us. So look, it's a matter of fact that we don't really respond with any kind of grave moral concern, as a community to natural embryo loss, which he also thinks is inflated in the stats. He thinks there's some reason to think that that some of these embryos that are being lost are defective in some kind of genetic way, that things aren't aligned quickly, and the human reproductive system flushes it out because it isn't going to work out. Like, that's a hypothesis that's out there you should be aware of. And so he thinks the numbers are lower. All right. He also thinks too that our sense of we don't care about this is exaggerated, right? He actually thinks that people do care about this. There are a lot of women who are trying to get pregnant and they grieve the loss of like an early miscarriage or things like this. All right. And so he just thinks that, look, people care about this a lot. They can't get pregnant. This might be one of the reasons why. And it should also maybe spur us to research this problem more and take a look at it, because there are so many people who are struggling with getting pregnant, and figuring out how to minimize this issue would not only, right, save these lives, but also would encourage human flourishing and procreation. Okay, right? And so rather, right, our moral status should determine how others should respond to us. Okay, and that seems to be right? In Nazi Germany, okay, there was a lot of people who just responded to the Jews as a kind of pestilence. All right. And so that doesn't mean, though, like, wow, look, we all have bad attitudes towards the Jews, so there must be something wrong with them, or they must not somehow merit respect. It's like, no, they have moral status, and you should probably just change your attitudes, right? So that is how George responds to that problem. Okay. All right, so the questions for discussion here. Do you think that George has reasonably addressed all of the arguments against his position? Okay. If so, what did you find to be the most compelling part of his argument? If not, why not? Okay. Do you agree with his claim that what we fundamentally are, how am I phrasing this? Is organisms, right? Do you agree that what we are is an organism? Let's do that. Let's make English a little bit better here. That S out of there. Okay, if so, why? If not, what else then could we be? And then, do you agree that George has identified a sound basis for human equality that adequately grounds the right not to be killed? Okay, if so, why? If not, then what is it that grounds human equality and our right not to be killed? Okay. Also, too, please do not be afraid to pose your own questions. All right, I want to try to take the time to answer those. All right, and that'll help our class discussion online. What are your questions that you would like answered? All right, so this is the unit on embryos are not persons is all done. And if you have any questions for me, email me, and I will talk to you later.